Hey folks, good morning and thank you for being here. I want to start off by first offering my apologies in particular, for not being able to make this thesis workshop 2 weeks ago. See, a last minute meeting was called by senior management on changes to our workload, and it was marked urgent, so everyone needed to rush to this precise venue, in fact, so that we could get up to speed and understand how much more is expected of us in terms of teaching hours. So just as a little bit of a non-thesis workshop related content, I'm just going to share with you that we are all, as the Department of Psychology staff, expected to hit 675 hours of teaching every year. So that works itself up to what, 4 or 5 classes. You would realize that the psych department, its lecturers don't teach that amount. Why? Because unlike other departments, we also supervise thesis. We also engage in a lot of outreach work. That is, we go out and give marketing talks. I personally go out and run training. So a couple of weeks ago, I was running a training session on mindfulness-based strengths practices for the National Sports Institute. Just last week, I was at the United Kingdom Education Center running a short session on learn optimism. All this means is that all the hours just tally up differently for our department and our site department staff compared to that of other departments. But as with the rule, the general movement or the push towards standardization across the entire university, we're also expected to hit those 675 hours. Fortunately, our dear Associate Professor Victor Go has got our back and has made sure that, look, we have to consider the differences in the kinds of duties and responsibilities that site staff engage in. They are working. They're just not teaching full that amount of classes because we don't need to, right? We have other things that occupy our time as well. So that meeting was called to make sure that we are all on the same page in terms of what was expected. But let's not use that to eat up too much time into what we are here for today. So once again, I thank you for being here. And I've seen a couple of familiar faces. Some of you are currently doing PSY 202. So hello again. I hope you are doing well. Congratulations on the submission of your concept paper. Please don't look through my comments post because that often is a little bit more stress and anxiety provoking, as I've understood. But I aim to be as detailed as possible. You know that if you've taken classes with me before, there's a long stream and almost like an essay-like general feedback, which I'll send out. Please only attend to that when you're ready. My apologies if you clicked on it and say, oh my God, 202 results are out. No, I won't be able to, again, strange departmental policy prohibits us from releasing the actual numerical score or mark. So I've just given as much feedback as I can. But of course, if you need further clarification, just send me an email. I'll be happy to clarify that with you. Some of you have already taken PSY 202, and I think this would be most, I suppose, important for you to consider right now if you are starting or if you're already working on your thesis. And just by a show of hands so that I can pitch the content appropriately, how many of you are just starting out with your thesis? I know Jing Han, for instance, right? Just starting out, this is like the proposal writing phase. Yep, okay. I know from my quick scan of the room, like not a number of you are going to be starting your thesis next year. How many of you are in the middle of your thesis? So we've got a few, right? So maybe at this point, your proposal has been sent in, you're probably ready or have your ERB approved. So the different stages, right? I just want to get a sense of where you're at so that the material will be as relatable and useful as possible, right? So Wangxi, for instance, I think the bit there on methods, writing up is going to be off emphasis. But for those of you just starting out, then pay a little bit more attention to the initial part where we talk about conceptualizing, framing, pitching your research ideas, right, and selling your research ideas. Now, I was informed that a few more of your friends will be coming by. It is now 11:50. So I'm happy for the next 10 minutes or so for you to go ahead and ask absolutely any questions. I know this session has been run before by Giselle and Victor. They have approached the workshop differently from what I'm going to do today. I'm at heart a pragmatist. I'm going to offer you tips to say, this is practical, this is useful. At least I think it will be useful. And I'm going to base this on the many years that I've been at HELP, too long. In fact, this is my 15th year at HELP. So throughout that time, I've supervised some, well, majority, I say some, right? Majority to completion, about 400 students. Maybe I'll retire once I hit 500, right? But we'll see how that goes. Just ask me anything right now. This is your precious 10 minutes to ask absolutely any questions, no matter how out of the field, no matter how weird or random it might be. If we have an additional mic, it might be useful to just hand it over. If not, I'll come to you, right? Absolutely common. How do I choose lectures for? Correct. How do I choose students? You know, it might surprise you to know that I don't choose per se. Say this person has a nice name, or I know this person, so this person, well, you know, I get to work. I would like to work with them. It's much more a match in terms of subject matter interest. I never look through any of your previous academic records. I don't look through your previous research methods, subjects, performance, right? I go in this selection, if you will, Carmen, as blind as possible. Say, is this a good idea? Is this an interesting idea? Is it conveyed interestingly for me to want to know more about it? So whether you realize this or not, you might approach a supervisor by thinking, I got to learn a lot from them. But my approach tends to be, can I learn from the student? Is that something that the student is interested in that I would personally find fascinating and want to know more? You'll find that this is an approach that a lot of journals also take. Is this someone who's going to be submitting a paper that's going to be relevant and meaningful and interesting in advancing the conversation, advancing the scientific conversation forward? And many times, if you respond by saying, here's my idea, I don't really have it all fleshed out yet, but the basic idea is that AI is taking over and people are confusing AI conversations as therapeutic. Why is that the case? Here's a rough model. Then yeah, that's great. Look, I've actually supervised students I've only met like maybe once in person, but just on the strength, the interest, the elegance, if you will, of the idea, I've just said that that's great. I want to learn more about this. So it's very much based on how you present the ideas. So if there's any criteria, so to speak, right, it's how well you convey a potentially interesting idea so that we can have that conversation throughout the entire year over your thesis supervision or over your thesis as a whole. Yes, question? Okay. Because Halloween is coming up, let me just share with you a little bit of the health department psychology lore. About 5 years ago, to answer your question, Miss, 5 years ago, in fact, no, 5 years ago was COVID. This was maybe 10 years ago already. A couple of students actually came in dressed for Halloween in a very trick-or-treat sort of way. And they were dressed as signs that were scary, kind of like what you were sharing. So one of them came dressed as an ERB sign, can you believe it? And it said like rejected, right? So he was walking around as if he was this rejected ERB sign. And it's like, it's a scary thing. You know how people sometimes carve check engine lights onto pumpkins? You've probably seen this before. This is like the health psych department equivalent. Look, if it's any reassurance, as chair of the ERB committee, I will tell you that 90% of the time, submissions are conditionally approved. You would have to do something quite terrible, like not complete an entire section. If your topic is also not one that is sensitive to a point where you're interviewing people with, you know, past traumatic experiences, people who are on the brink of, you know, committing, if I can use the term right, dying by suicide or suicide ideation, then for the most part, 90% of the time, your ERB is going to be approved, right? The conditional approve is for the supervisor. It's sent back. You might not have any comments, right? It gets sent back to the supervisor, say, look, just do a final check. I would also want to hold the supervisors responsible. Say, this is your student. You know better, right? You give the final approval, and they give you the code, right? So again, 90% of the time, you are going to get a conditional approval. That final chop of approval is going to come from your supervisor. How do you fail in getting your ERB approved? Well, like I said, firstly, you don't answer. You don't provide responses to one entire section. Please detail whether any deception will be used, whether you'll be asking participants to view confronting material. That entire section, we've had one case recently, did not answer. I said, you have to tell me, you have to tell us under review committee whether you're going to be using these materials or otherwise, okay? If there's consistent vagueness, that was another reason for why we reject ERBs. So I'm going to be sampling 100 undergraduate students. And then in the procedures, you say you're going to be sampling members of the general public as well. Sampling criteria, well, 18 to 25. And then on your informed consent form, on your Google form, it's 18 to 25 only, or 18 to 65. There's a lot of inconsistency. If there's enough inconsistency for us to say, I don't think the student is really certain about what is going to be done, nor the procedures, nor the aims, nor the steps that are going to be taken to ensure that the study is conducted professionally, that's when we tip it over to a rejection. Right? There's no longer a conditional rejection, it's just outright rejection. But we try very much, I will share with you, the ERB panel, myself as chair, we try very hard to not give a rejection. Why? Because it means more work for us as well. It comes back to us. And then next round, next month, when it's resubmitted, I have to tag it back to the initial reviewers. I have to match it in a way to say that, look, reviewer A, reviewer B, you attended to this submission last month. Could I get you to look at it again? Because you will be familiar. You're the ones who marked it as rejection. So that's how behind the scenes the process actually occurs. Hopefully that clarifies your question. Okay, good. Others? Okay.
Undergraduate thesis, is it practical to come up with a psychometric?
As an undergraduate thesis, for an undergraduate thesis, could we do a study in which we generate a new psychometric measure? It has been done before. Previously, when PSY 311 students, introduction to site testing students, this is their assignment. They do it as a group assignment. It's that 50% assignment, which if it hasn't changed yet, it's 50% as a group assignment. You are asked to develop a new measure. Could you do it for your undergraduate thesis? Previously, students have. It is possible, but recently, we don't see a lot of it. Why? You would know. It's a lot of work. This is actually a nice undergraduate thesis topic or sort of design, if you will, to do. Why? Because when you're developing a new measure, you're not just using exploratory factor analysis. You're not just constructing items. What do you need to do if you're developing a measure from scratch? You have to run another study. And what's that other study? It could be potentially qualitative. You're going to be asking people about their experiences so that you can generate items from the interview or the focus group accounts. You want to build a measure that speaks to the experiences of people who have gone through that experience. So what does this look like? It looks like two studies, and it's not just two simple correlational experimental studies, it's a mixed method study. It is a qualitative component at the start in which you interview or you conduct focus groups, and then you follow that up by, after analyzing the themes and the codes from your qualitative data, you generate items from it. I think it's really nice. Some people have been able to pull it off. The most ambitious, overly ambitious, as to say, thesis that I've supervised was a 3-study thesis. Qual, quant, quant, I think. Please don't do that. The appendices was very much as thick as a dictionary. I'm not sure if you remember the yellow pages, right? The phone directories used to be, oh, good, so we're not too far apart in terms of age. So you still remember a time, right? I'm going to hold off until a time where no one knows what the yellow pages are anymore. Maybe I'll stop teaching then, move on to something else, right? But yeah, not impossible, just a lot of work. I wouldn't recommend it unless, number one, you're ambitious, you're clear, and maybe you have a sprinkling of academic masochism. You like suffering through intellectually difficult problems. Okay, right, so that would be, was that a follow-up question, Jack?
Yeah.
Yes, what was it?
Would be a suitable supervisor.
Mixed methods, no, I don't think there's anyone in the divide. PSY 202 I've shared with some of you, used to be advanced qualitative research and mixed methods designs. We no longer have that because why? A couple of years ago, the university decided to move into big data and neuroscience research, which is very much quant in nature. I think this is a bit of a missed opportunity. If we could have equipped you with the proficiency of both qualitative and quantitative methods, and then take it one step further to say that you can combine these both. a whole bunch of new areas of research open up when you are familiar with the use of both qual and quant and know how to use them in complementary manner. If you are familiar with that, I can probably explore that with you, but I don't think I'm the one, right? And this is not like bad humor or anything, but I don't think I'm going to be the one that's going to get a heart attack when they read your work. Your co-marker or your co-assessor might. Terrible. So should you be laughing at that? Maybe, maybe not. So some of you are laughing at that, right? But no, it's a lot of work, right? And we don't have any policies right now to say this is the word limit for a mixed method study, simply because students don't do that anymore. The last mixed method study was, I think, conducted and submitted in 2018. Have you guys heard of the term anti-fragility? Things that actually get stronger because they experience setbacks or failures. It's different from resilience. When you think about resilience, it's bouncing back, isn't it? Well, it's not purely bouncing back, but anti-fragility is the idea that some people need to experience setbacks, challenges, disappointments, failures, of course, in order to be better. They don't just adapt to failure. They need to be, in a way, broken before they can be better. So this student actually developed a measure to measure psychological anti-fragility. I personally think that was quite interesting. A few more of your friends popping by. Hello, good afternoon. On the hour mark. All right, I could probably hit one more question, one very generic, random, unusual question even. We'll have more time for this, yeah, at the end of our session today. 1 year. Is it possible to conduct this mixed method study, qual, quant, quant, qual, however you want to sequence it, in one year? Yes. I remember the student applying for ERB twice. Why? Because you need a different ERB clearance for the qualitative study. And then once you generate the items, right, you can't get the quantitative ERB approval until you have the items. So you need to run and conduct a qualitative study. Analyze it using thematic analysis, generate the items. Then you have the measures, which you can put as an appendix, saying that this is the measure that I am going to test. And collect data for test, run exploratory factor analysis. I can't remember how this stretched out to 3 studies for some reason, right? But maybe it's a little bit of a suppressed memory. Let's not go back, right? There's a phone book appendix I have to review. Yep. Good question. Okay, so Huaixi's question here is, do we need a pilot study for the qualitative component? And some ways in which you can make this a little bit more manageable, right, folks, is to just test the initial interview or focus group questions with 1 or 2 participants. If the 1 or 2 participants don't find that the questions are phrased ambiguously, they understood what the questions were asking of them, then it's fine to combine the pilot 2 with the fuller non-pilot sample. You're, in this case, subsuming the sample from the pilot to the total. Okay? All right, let's get going because it is 12:04. Again, I promise you we will have time for more interesting, casual, off the cuff, if that's the term, or unusual, I should say, creative questions that you might have. Welcome, for those of you who just stepped in. This is a 1.5-hour thesis workshop, and it's just simply titled How to Conduct and Report Standout Research Studies. Most of it is going to focus on framing, writing, presentation, beyond what you've already been covered in your research methods classes. Maybe these are some of the things that lecturers, including myself, don't tell you directly. It's also going to include a couple of things which the thesis supervisor might not have introduced to you. Not any of their fault, certainly not any of the research methods lecturer's fault, not certainly the thesis supervisor's fault. The thesis supervisor's aim is to clarify the process with you. My job here today, and I hope to accomplish this, is by the end of the 90 minutes, you walk away with a better understanding of the behind the scenes look What really happens when your thesis is received? How is it assessed? What do supervisors look for? What do co-markers look for? If they're not the same thing, what happens if there are disputes in between what the supervisor says and what the co-marker assesses the work to be? Yes, sometimes we have disputes like that. Sometimes we get the supervisor not agreeing to the co-marker's assessment. So how do we align this, right? So we're going to discuss some of that. And just to give you an overview, some of the sections here are going to be a little bit more relevant to you than others, and that's totally fine. Again, depending on where you're at in the thesis process, right? Some of the sections are going to be a lot more helpful, a lot more practical. We'll start off first by just giving you a round, the entire process look at what your thesis rather should be, right? And what the supervision process is meant to include and what it should not include. We'll talk next about topic selection. And here, I know this is going to be a very broad discussion. You have a wide range of interests. The supervisors and co-markers themselves have a wide range of interests. So how do you know the topic is worth selecting? I answered some part of this question earlier by telling you that, is it something that's not been done before? Is it something interesting? Is it something that I personally want to know more of? The same process happens when you're applying for your postgraduate studies. You have to match your interest with a supervisor who is also interested in that topic. I don't like to use the term matchmaking because people have equated supervision selection as like dating and matchmaking. I think that's a bit crossing a boundary or a barrier here, but principle holds. Similarity and a match of interests is what makes the supervisory relationship work, right? A few points and tips on a literature review and theoretical framework. Notice 202 students, I put them together, they go together, bread and butter, black and white, salt and pepper, together, okay? So why do we place them together and what are some of the qualities of having them together, right? Some of the things that I've also observed over a broad span of the many years here of reading, all right, 300, 400 plus thesis. Methods and results, we're going to go through that fairly quickly, but just some general principles on what we should be reporting and what we tend to look for in your write-up. The discussion is the part that trips a lot of people up. If you do an assessment of the weightage and the marks awarded across the different sections of a thesis, I'm going to bet you that the discussion session is the one that often gets the lowest grade. Why? Why? Because firstly, right, I'll just say this, by the time you get to the discussion, you want the pain to end. You want the suffering to end already. And so people rush through it. They run out of steam and they say that, you know what, just, I'm just gonna let this thesis die a slow, painful enough death. I don't want to do anything. So if you get to that point and experience that, right, know that you're not alone. Master students, PhD students, the moment they complete their thesis, it's not them jumping for joy. It's not a point in which you say that, yay, this is like my best work ever. I'm so proud of myself. No, they just want to be done with it. It is often relief that they feel once they finish their thesis. But just before though, notice that the discussion also weighs a lot. It's exactly 30 marks. So there's no running away from the need to write a good discussion. You have started well, please end well. And I'm going to give you some suggestions on how to write a good discussion. Let's kick things off. Here is me trying to establish with you what an undergraduate thesis is and what it is not. The slides have already been given to you, right? So you can hand them out and you can use them, you can print them out and use them as a reference, right? The first thing that we look for, and it's an opportunity for you to do so, your PSY 300 thesis is for you to show independence of thought. It is for you to exhibit your potential as a scientist. You may not have a formal career as a scientist or as a researcher, but we want you to play a role in contributing to the psychological literature. We want you to be able to show that you can think, formulate, conceptualize, develop, execute a study independently. All those are just really fancy terms that you'll find on your Bloom's taxonomy. But in every single undergraduate, honors, master's, PhD level thesis, the thesis is an opportunity for you to show independence of thought. Those words that I've just described also go into your reference letters, When I write reference letters for students, I'll say the student has been able to formulate, conceptualize, design, execute, and report the findings of an independent study. That is what we want to see in you. You have been learning, you have been acquiring knowledge over the past 3.5 years, right? Prior to you starting your thesis. You are now in the driver's seat of needing to create, uncover, report new knowledge. This is the pinnacle. This is the highest level, if you will, of the Bloom's taxonomy that we expect from you. A chance for you to apply what you've learned across your research modules. And one thing that I've observed, right, in high-scoring thesis is that they may not necessarily use every single thing that they've learned. Oh, shock horror. You don't need to know every single, you don't have to remember every single stats test. You just need to know the right ones to use. So the research training and the lab reports that you write up for your assignments, these are all your training grounds for you to be much more familiar with methods, approaches, tools, ways of conceptualizing, ways of analysis, and reporting. But which one you use in particular, that is up to you to decide based on how you conceptualize the study. Here's something that maybe a lot of academics don't tell you. A lot of professors, they may not necessarily be very, very skilled in methods. They work with someone who is maybe a methodologist. I know of one professor I've heard, for instance, who only knows one statistical tool. They know regression, and that is it. You guys actually know more, but which ones you should use to get that work in shape, that is what we're testing. There are professors out there, once again, let me say, they only know one particular tool. This is their specialty. They know every single thing that needs to be known about a regression analysis. They know everything about structural equation modeling, and that's their favorite go-to. It's kind of like if you have a favorite tool and you know it works for you, you keep going back to it. That's what a lot of professors do and what their general preferences are, unless, of course, they teach research methods, so they know a little bit of everything. Okay? But for you, use what is most relevant. Use what is most appropriate to ensure that your study comes out rigorous, scientifically valid. Your co-assessors, supervisor, and your co-marker nod their head along and say, this makes sense. I can see why you did that. I can see why when the assumptions are not met, you did this instead. You engage in data transformation, you use a non-parametric test. If you can show that, then that's it. I wouldn't worry too much about your methods or analysis section. Last, as I said this before, yeah, your own ability to understand. Where does that understanding come from? Reading, conceptualizing, framing, and then forming your own arguments. You're not starting from scratch. You are starting from an established, fairly established body of evidence. And you're saying that having read this body of evidence, I think the conversation can be extended if we decide to, if we consider the relationships, the interactions, the mediating, moderating effect of these other variables. Here's how I'm going to contribute to the conversation. That's where the understanding comes from. Where does the argument come from? Having reviewed all the evidence, my argument is essentially this. Notice that your literature review is not just a summary. We will get into this in a short while later. But many times, the literature review / theoretical framework, salt and pepper go together. They are oftentimes just a list of points that are framed in sentences. If you distinguish each of the sentences by bits and their pieces, you could just arrange them in bullet points. That literature not review summary is simply a list of those sentences presented as, well, one sentence after the other with the bullet points removed. Okay. Synthesize, but also form your own arguments. Here's what your undergraduate thesis is not. It's not another lab report. Maybe this is just me picking on the terms, right? But it's not just something that you conduct in the lab just as a one-off. So I would not treat it as a lab report. It certainly goes beyond that. That being said, please manage your ambitions, your expectations. It is not a Nobel Prize winning work. None of the studies that we have supervised so far, not your fault, not certainly any, right? At the undergraduate level, what you will want is to show sufficiently that you know how to identify gaps in knowledge and then contribute to it. Conducting multiple studies are not required unless you have very good reason to. You can ask Victor about this, right? He ran 2 studies. But then again, I think there's a very beautiful elegance in the way in which he's conducted the study. 2 studies, one replicating after the other, both of which were analyzed using a simple t-test. So it doesn't have to be needlessly, endlessly complex. No one is going to win a Nobel Prize for this. You get a Nobel Prize for years of accumulated research and groundbreaking research, and maybe that comes later, much later in your careers, right? But for the undergraduate thesis, keep the expectations manageable. You are going to thank yourself for it. Okay. Last bit. It's not the final piece of research that you do. If you are so inclined, if you're interested in pursuing postgraduate research, I recommend trying to do your best for your undergraduate thesis. This would put you in good standing with your postgraduate review committee. If they find that your work is consistent with your future supervisor's interests, they are more likely to consider you for a position for that program, for that internship, for that research studentship, right? The student is applying for studentship right now. She did some research on parenting and gratitude, and she's found that there's a studentship being offered at Oxford. So I want to apply for this, right? But it goes hand in hand. Her interests, her experience align with her future postgraduate plans. So think about this in the long term. And even if you don't want to do research beyond this, past this, that's totally fine. Give yourself the gift and the credit, right, of saying that this is work that I am proud of, and I will want to place this on my CV. Capiche? Got it? Okay, we will move on, right? Here's a question, and I think we'll also extend on this quite a fair bit, right? A little bit of maybe friendly gossip, right? What does Jeremiah really look for? What does Kelly look for in the thesis? I can tell you, right? So here's what I look for. Here's what I will look for, and this is the set of general themes in my comments. Please align your arguments with one another. There's something called theoretical coherence. A couple of weeks ago, this just crossed my mind, right? We had a gathering amongst it sounds like a cult, isn't it? A meeting amongst thesis supervisors. And I was asked by Victor to say, could you maybe give some or share some tips on how you supervise? So that was the other side of the coin. I'm here with you today, right? Talking about here's what goes on behind the scenes. And different supervisors will look for different things. Just be aware that your supervision, your supervisory experience, your own supervisor, their experiences are shaped by how they were supervised. You probably heard of something in developmental psychology called like intergenerational trauma, right? This is similar. If the supervisor does not have a good experience in the past, right, sometimes it carries forth in the way they supervise. A former colleague of mine said that, well, I'm especially harsh and picky and pedantic because my supervisor was the same. Yeah, intergenerational supervision trauma, right? That happens. There is a bias, but just be aware of that, right? You won't uncover all this at the start. So what's the best that you could do? Ask the supervisor. What do you generally look for in a thesis? What counts as a high distinction thesis? I will tell my students this if they were to ask me this question. And I will tell you this right now, that these are the three things that I generally look for, right? Firstly, theoretical coherence. From that thesis meeting with the supervisors, you know what we've noticed? Many of you really love self-determination theory. It's almost as if you could add, right? It's almost like sriracha sauce. You can add it to anything and it would still be okay. No. You can't just add chili sauce to everything just to make it look good, right? In the same way, you can't just have a one-size-fits-all theory in the form of self-determination theory applied to everything. There have been a few studies, for instance, I've shared this with some of you yesterday, that here's a study on relationships. I'm going to use self-determination theory. But wait, self-determination theory only covers one component that pertains to connections to others, relatedness needs. It doesn't say anything, your work, on competence or autonomy. So is the theory a good match for it? So I look for a theoretical link, theoretical coherence, a very nice weaving together of theory and evidence that you use to form your own arguments. I also look for something called alignment. If there's a disconnect between your initial write-up, your theoretical framework / literature review, doesn't quite inform or logically lead to your research question, then there's a break in the chain. It's almost as if there's a flow that has been disrupted because it is not aligned. The review of the evidence doesn't justifiably or logically lead me to ask this research question. And when you don't have that connection in between the sections, it makes the thesis very difficult to follow. It's almost as if you're reviewing one thing, but exploring another. And that's a further disconnect the question is not answered by the method you employ, which subsequently is then not analyzed in the right approach or not using the right statistical tool. And I think I probably don't need to stretch this out, right? But in the end, the discussion also does not connect back to the literature review. So I'm looking for that alignment as well. I also look for something called parsimony, which means elegance, which means to the point. It makes sense. This is such a joy to read. If I don't leave a lot of comments on a thesis, you can ask some seniors, right? How I generally mark thesis is how I review articles. I write them out on a separate document. I don't leave the comments. I type out comments, right? Kind of like that long, scary document that some of you saw yesterday on the 202 LMS. It's like that, but for every single thesis. Okay? I'm looking for parsimonious explanations. Not to say that you should simplify your writing to a point where it just so is intuitive. The best theses that I've come across are those who are able to explain and argue for complex enough, interesting ideas, but in an accessible and readable way. Another way in which you can ensure this quality, this parsimony, is to ensure that you don't toss in theory upon theory. That's an observation, especially when we get to the discussion section. Like, here's a theory that explains why I did not find the results. Don't use theories to explain inconsistencies. You have a theoretical framing at the start already. That's your theoretical framework. That's what the theoretical framework is meant to achieve. If you then suddenly invoke another theory in the discussion, I'm going to think, if you knew this was going to happen, if you knew this was a possibility, why did you not consider it in the first place? It's almost as if you are writing with a kind of theoretical hindsight bias. Avoid that. Okay, so next point, supervisors. Oh, there's one, right, I often observe with research methods lectures. Please don't tell them that. Actually, you can, because I'm actually one of them as well. We will emphasize design, methods, procedures, analysis that are robust. So because they teach the subject, they know that this sticks in their mind more clearly. They will then look for indications of when the research design holds up and when it doesn't. We have some, I'm not going to name who, right, but we have some lecturers, supervisors who focus a lot on sample size. We have others who, there was one a long time ago who didn't leave a lot of comments on the thesis, but had a ton of comments for the references. I'm not sure why. I think it's just easier than say, okay, this is APA formatting. And the students clearly not follow APA formatting, so I'm going to emphasize very much on that. I've been on committees where I try not to roll my eyes when I do this because it's very impolite, right? But when a co-supervisor says that, I notice most of your references are from earlier, before 2000. Can you please explain why you don't use more recent sources? I think that's a rubbish comment. That's really a silly comment. If the article is seminal work, if self-determination theory, for instance, was published by Ryan and Eugene in 2000, that's 25 years now, and it's still relevant, that's the first paper that really introduced the concept, it's a highly cited paper, go ahead and cite it. You'll find that I fuss very, very little about formatting and references. Other lecturers will fuss a little bit more on that. Another thing, when you get to your thesis oral defense, your viva, if your co-marker or your supervisor asks you this question, I think you have the presentation in the back, means you have done well. This is a back pocket question. When supervisors and co-markers don't know what else to ask because the study is like, yeah, either I don't understand it or I haven't read it or it sounds all very good, you know what they tend to ask? That's very interesting. If you were to run the study again, what would you do differently? That's a back pocket question. So the moment they ask you that is the moment you realize that, hey, I think I know more. You would certainly have to know more about the topic than your supervisor or your co-marker. But the moment they ask you that question, you will know with a fair amount of confidence and certainty that you have this in the bag. They don't really have specific questions to ask anymore. Once again, that question is, if you were to run the study again, what would you do differently? Of course, in the back of your mind, you might be thinking, I won't do this study again, right? But you would just humor them and then just say that, well, I might maybe expand on this, maybe take a cross-cultural sample, I might just tweak the measures, use a shorter scale. I noticed a couple of dropouts from or high attrition rates. And so I would like to maybe just use a shorter scale, right? That might lead to another follow-up question. Why did you not consider this in the first place, right? But that can go on, right? Check with your supervisors' research interests and their backgrounds. All supervisors, all scientists have their own biases. You can ask me what my biases are, and they will generally tend to be, look, I want clear, to the point, cohesively argued writing. I place quite a high emphasis on writing clarity. I will strain to try and understand what you're trying to say or how you're trying to express your ideas. But if repeatedly the writing gets in the way, I'm only human. We get annoyed. Reviewers also get annoyed. Proofread your work, right, would be my suggestion for you if I was assessing your work. Any other questions you might just want to ask? I know this session is being recorded, and I'm not going to badmouth any of my peers certainly, but I can tell you generally what different co-markers look for. Whether it be methods, concepts, whether it be formatting. Strict in one sense, common. They like, okay, Mr. Jeremiah does a lot of supervision on parasocial relationships and relationships in general. I mean, that's a subject that he teaches. I think based on the comments, most of the time I've co-marked with him, so I know a thing or two, right? A balance of both concept and some of the more surface level methods related issues, right? So did you sample enough? This description of the methods or the procedures was not entirely clear. So that kind of comments. But as for what really stands out in terms of like strictness, I've not had a lot of disputes or disagreements. Disputes is such a strong word, so I'm not going to use it. Disagreements with marks. Do you know that when we grade your thesis, the supervisor and the co-assessor, our marks need to be within a 9-mark difference? You don't know this. This is not like hidden, secret messages or a secret underlying process that we're keeping. No, we have to. Because if there's a greater discrepancy between my mark and the other person's mark, whether I'm grading 9 marks higher, more than 9 marks higher, or the co-assessor is grading much lower or much higher than I, well beyond the 9 marks, we have to come together and make peace with our scoring. We have to agree that this is the quality of the work and the widest range that separates your assessment and my assessment is 9 marks. You will never find, in fact, it has been quite comical and humorous when it first happened. There were previously 20, 30 mark differences. How does this happen? One person says that this is just a passing thesis. No, this is the best work I've seen. This is my best student, right? 20, 30 mark difference, right? If that cannot be resolved, it often goes to a third marker. And the third marker's final mark is taken as the final. Okay. Jeremiah, I don't think there's a lot to be, yeah, I don't think there are any like quirks or, but if you're saying that he's particular about certain things, maybe just ask your friend what is that he's particular with. As far as I can tell, we all take note of concerns of formatting, right? What I would consider to be minor things, but I think he's fairly balanced across. He's quite specific though, I should say, with his comments. So I've noticed his comments before have been quite wordy. So maybe that gives off the impression that he's quite strict. Okay. Kelly, I've co-marked with her, but not a full thesis yet. She's asked a few questions of my students on methods, procedures, sample size, right? Maybe it comes from just her recency, a more recency effect of her teaching PSY 202, right? Generalizability also, I think she's asked a question a few times already, right? A lot on the methods, right? Some clarification on the proposed mediating relationship that one of my students tested. So those kinds of comments. You see, nothing too revealing to a point where you should avoid this. I'm never going to say, right, that avoid this, pick this, be careful of this, right? No, I'm just giving you general across the board what these assessors tend to look for. For Kelly, I think mostly I see the comments in the methods and procedures. Jan, is it? Jan is very quick. She's very efficient. She's also part of the ERB committee, so she's very fast. She's very efficient, right? So with Jan, I think with a background in clinical side, she also reviews for the department journal, and I think you would notice that she gives fairly detailed comments as well. Yep. So details, the devil is in the details, right, so to speak. She's based on her review of a recent article submitted to the Journal of Asian Perspectives on Psychology. Quite a few related to stats and analysis. I know this. Framing, conceptualization, I don't know too much because I don't co-assess work with her that much. But generally, what have your impressions on top of her efficiency, which I think is something that should be applauded? You will want your comments and your feedback soon, no, rather than later. Mm. Okay, right. So it sounds like she keeps the project manageable for you, right? To the point. Don't offer too complicated and overly complicated, overly complex. Rather say for instance, that sounds like her. That sounds like her, right? Practical, pragmatic, even I should say. I think this is why generally, right, amongst the departments like staff, right, we hold impressions about certain individuals, and what you've just described, Wangzi, would be very similar to what our team also has towards her. Very on the ball, very quick to respond, pragmatic. She's a great emergency reviewer for when we need one additional reviewer for an ERB, right? So she does that really, really quickly. So you can count on her for that. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Okay. Maybe just one more. Marking of qualitative papers, that's a good question. There are a few lecturers who are much more attuned to, much more familiar with qualitative method. That's actually going to lead to an interesting point as well. Supervisors such as Lavanya, Mary Beth, right, they tend to favor qualitative methods, right? So they will be particularly interested in if you are going to propose a qualitative study, but they are also going to judge the qualitative approach much more sternly if you decide that. And see, remember what lecturers are most familiar with, they will scrutinize a lot more. Okay, that's the general principle. But those would be the two I have in mind. Bashir used to supervise core research. I no longer supervise core research unless it is a master's student, in which then I recommend them do a mixed method study, qual, quant, or quant, qual. I'm only basically familiar. I mean, I did it a long time ago for my dissertation. I like quantitative research, but I wouldn't say that I'm skilled enough to be able to, cover its nuances or apply it as well as maybe someone who's done it for far more, used it much more like the money. Okay. All right, we should move on. We will have time for more of these questions, right? But let's move on to the next slide. If your supervisors have any papers, ask them for copies of it. You know what the currency in academia is? It's ego. This is a practical point. The last time I went for a research pitch meeting, you know why industry people are frustrated with working with academics? Because it's always about papers, it's always about citations, it's always about grants, right? Yes, that's a money component to it, but most of the time, academics want their ideas to be heard. They want their papers to be cited. Ask for it. If your supervisor is someone who has put out a few papers, right, or maybe presented recently, ask them about it. They'll be happy. They'll be more than happy to tell you about it. Now take it from me, right? When I tell people about my ideas out there on the street, no one listens to me. Okay. Not that it's a bad thing, right? I don't do that very often. Okay. Here is a suggestion for topic selection. If you are wondering what you should do for your research topic, I challenge you to explore the frontiers of knowledge, to go where no mind or maybe no researcher has gone before. Not out there so far out to the point where you have no scaffolding, you have nothing to base your understanding on. But I like to jump to the final analogy there, right? I'll walk through all the points there. You imagine yourself as a kind of ship or a vessel. How far can you sail out into the ocean while still keeping an eye out? Because of a lighthouse, right? There's a lighthouse that guides you. Think about a lighthouse as kind of like the existing evidence, the existing literature, theories that will help you understand where your vessel should go and go no further than that. Maybe at the edges of where the light shines from the lighthouse. Now, the reason why I encourage you to do this is because, firstly, I have heard supervisors and co-markers saying that I'm supervising a student. The topic is so boring. They will say that. They will say that. I mean, there are no names or anything. I can't even remember the name of the student, right? But they will say, look, this is an interesting study. Again, goes back to interest. I want to read more about this. This is a fascinating study. I don't know what the result is going to be like until I read the study. And this is a topic that fascinates me. Catch your attention. Start off with an interesting research idea. Get the reader thinking. Get the reader interested. From the thesis supervision meeting with staff, right, we have a lot of, over the years, we've had different trends in topics. It started off many, many years ago, 15 years ago right now, right? A lot of stuff on music and memory. That doesn't seem to be a big thing right now. And then we had something called the, kind of like the descent illusion, something like, you know, the inclines of a hill, right? The perception of the steepness of the incline affects something about behaviors. Can't remember what it is. It's a very weird study. You know what's another weird-ish study that is still of interest? And certainly if you're interested in that, please tell me more about that, right? Because I only have a limited understanding of the effects of autonomous sensory meridian response, ASMR studies. Actually, we have a grant by the department, the awarded to a department by Sony, that is interested in ASMR's effects on something or other. I don't get that tingly sensation. I know very little about it, right? I've not supervised it, right? But that's another thing that has been fairly interesting. But the more recent hot topic, this gets a mixed response, right? Because some people are interested in it. Some of its supervisors are, yeah, this is great. Others are not. Parasocial relationships. That's like the in thing, the in trend right now. It might be because of Jeremiah's class, right? But I'm not going to say too much about that. A fair bit on newer forms of relationships as well, if that intrigues you. So there have been increasing interest in situationships. Like, what is that? Just ask person whether you're my boyfriend or my girlfriend, right? So just, yeah. Oh. Yeah, so these are some of the topics that have been a topic of interest. Not all, if you want to do it, I'm just saying that I don't know anything about it, right? Maybe I don't have the theoretical, certainly don't have the practical understanding of it, right? But if it's a novel enough idea and you can convince your reader, if you convince me, for instance, you know why parasocial relationships are important? You know why? Because it's tied to loneliness. You ever notice why people form relationships more with these fictional characters or maybe real life characters from a distance post-COVID? They are longing for something. They are looking for something. Then you have my attention. Right. So a couple of points here as we move on. And I like that quote then, the second point then, by Peter Drucker. It's not a research book. Avoid conducting studies of increasing irrelevance with increasing precision. There's this one little tiny research gap, right, that we should address. The previous study tells us that it is marginally significant. There's been a slight effect. Some studies find it, some studies don't. I'm going to advance it even further by making use of more measures, more rigorous, stringent set of procedures. I'm going to pad it out with this other measure, right? So the methods certainly become more complex, but the contribution of the study is not guaranteed beyond what we already know. So avoid studies like that. Novel ideas suggest novel thinkings. This also tells us that you are brave enough. You're taking that intellectual curiosity and converting that into intellectual courage. You are saying that I am going to contribute new knowledge. And I think this is worth looking into for all these reasons. There's a clear theoretical and practical significance in what I am proposing from this work. Sell your idea that way. That being said, avoid completely novel studies. There are no theories, no studies have been conducted. For such studies, right, folks, you would want to start with a purely qualitative study. And if you're not aiming to create theory from the ground up, then stick with a study that has already some established evidence, some theoretical backing, some initial findings. Keep an eye out for the new topics that are emerging. If you look far beyond, not too far beyond, I've shared this with you. I think it's interesting to look into toxic positivity, for instance. I think that's an interesting area. It's only now that we're starting to accumulate the evidence for it. Okay, so that is it. No questions at this point. Maybe we'll take your questions at a later bit, right? We're about just slightly under halfway through and we need to catch up with this. Okay, start strong is my next tip. What is the perfect first sentence? It's not going to exist until you have an outline, unless you start writing, unless you start compiling all your points together. Here's a tip. Here's a writing tip. That first sentence is the last thing you write. Make it the last thing you write. You can always go back to your draft and just say, what's going to make for a better, more enticing, more impactful first sentence? You don't get a second chance at this. So if your first sentence is unjustified claims, a broad, very vague statement, it's not a definition, the safest opening sentence is, of course, a definition. But I think you can go beyond that. If you're really stuck in your draft, start with a definition. Toxic positivity is defined as, emotional intelligence is defined as, customizable AI pornography is defined as, self-determination theory prescribes, right? Simple, vanilla, not too interesting, but safe. You usually won't go wrong. No co-marker or assessor is going to say boring first sentence. No, they will not judge it that way, right? But if you want to catch their attention, you're going to have to write a little bit more differently, right? So that's the third point. So I've given you an example here of safe and clear versus what I think is enticing, at least what is going to get me to read and continue reading, right? So this is an example based off emotional intelligence. You can solve with the definition, but I like, and I'll call your attention to the enticing table there. Organizations spend this amount of money on EI training, yet all the EI training assumes that this is going to lead to positive outcomes. This has never been questioned or challenged before. I don't know about you, but I would want to read more. So there is a dark side to EI. I've always assumed that emotionally intelligent people are great at work, they're great at relationships, they tend to earn more money, right? Yep, some research evidence for that. But I didn't know that there could be a dark side to emotional intelligence. Tell me more is the response that you want to get. Next point, as you start and as you continue your writing, join the dots. Link your sentences with your paragraphs. Remember this aspect of flow and alignment, not just in between paragraphs, but between sentences as well. There's almost like a degree or a scale that you can imagine. On one side, you have a list of points not connected with one another. It's almost like an outline. You've maybe extracted key points from your reading. You place them point. And then in the rush towards writing a literature review, you realize that I don't have enough time to formulate all the arguments. So you just start stringing them together. You remove the bullet points. You join them up as sentences. And you find out, grammatically, this doesn't make sense. What do? You just say, furthermore, on the other hand, in addition to, for example, those conjunctions don't make the cut. They are not sufficient, not in general, in combining ideas together. Connecting ideas requires more than just making use of terms such as furthermore, in addition to, next, right? These are all common terms that we see. So as a whole, if you don't connect your ideas with one another well enough, what's going to happen is that it's going to be presented more as a summary, a compilation of points without the bullet points. Points without the bullet points. That's unfortunately what quite a number of literature reviews are like. Okay. Another point here on writing, avoid reference spamming. And this is another common thing. I've been called out for this before. I've submitted papers and the reviewers come back and say, is this amount of references really necessary? If it's tangential, fancy term for saying that only minimally related to your main point, avoid it. Some of the clearest, most concise, most impactful writing is it follows this format. Point A, reference. Connection to, related to. Point B, second reference. This is in addition to this third point, which is consistent with points 1 and 2, reference number 3. All these seems to indicate a common theme in the finding. That's where your argument comes in. You've used evidence. You've cited the appropriate sources. You limited each point to 1 citation per point. And then you draw your own conclusion in the third or that fourth sentence to say, here's the theme. Yeah, you might have read all the same papers that I have, but I'm going to tell you something that you did not realize, even if you've read those papers. Make yourself sound smart. The best writers leave their readers feeling that the readers themselves are smarter for having read the work. You will want to create that impression in your supervisor and your co-marker. Avoid reference spamming. Another general tip, which is not on the slide, right? Place your references whenever you can. If it's a simple one argument, one reference format, place it at the end. Previous studies indicate that emotional intelligence bracket T 2024, right, is associated with placing the reference in the middle of a sentence breaks the flow. It breaks the rhythm of the writing. And that's a terrible example because you don't know what this T person is actually claiming. There's no key point yet, right? Other points, one main idea per paragraph. I like, and I really encourage you to consider using subheaders. Why? You're going to guide the reader. Think about subheaders as flag posts, signposts for what the reader is expecting to read next. Those subheaders are going to be themes, broad themes for what you are writing about. Just like you, supervisors and co-markers also don't like a death wall of text. They want breaks in between. They want to know that this section is going to be about the links between loneliness and parasocial relationship. And this is a logical follow-up from the previous sections that talked about loneliness separately, a so-called loneliness epidemic. And it's going to be different from the initial opening paragraph that talks about what parasocial relationships are, why it is seen to be more common, a rough estimate of how many people engage in or have parasocial relationships. See how the ideas flow from one to the next. You'll want to build up your argument incrementally. You'll want to fit in a logical structure of understanding in the mind of your reader to say, I know where this is going. I can see where this is going. And then when you get to your research question, the reader is going to say, that makes sense. I know what you know. I understand what you're claiming. I know what your arguments are, and I know the justification for why you think answering this research question is important. Lead the reader to a conclusive and convincing and certainly logical research question. You are guiding your readers, whether you realize it or not, when you write well. Okay? Now, next question, oftentimes asked, what makes for a good research gap? I want you to hold this principle in hand. A twist in the tail. As an unexpected, it is an unthought of, it is an assumption that you challenge. It is a widely held belief that you would call into question using science and evidence. Controversial, unexpected, thought-provoking alternative possibilities, any fancy terms that tells you that you're an independent thinker, because all this essentially is you saying that I think differently and I have good reasons to think differently. Previous studies tell us that, and here's one, right, not on the slide. Previous studies tell us that reading literature can enhance empathy. But you know what? It doesn't enhance all kinds of empathy. It only enhances one kind of empathy. You know what the problem with previous research is? When you take the perspective of another person, you're engaging in what we call cold empathy. Just because you know another person's perspective, their state of mind, doesn't mean that you feel alongside with them. Reading fiction does not improve emotional empathy. It may increase cognitive empathy, cold empathy, but it does not move us in the same way as face-to-face emotional contagion processes does. That kind of real heart-to-heart empathy, so to speak. So if you pitch your idea in that way, it is controversial. People are going to likely say, you know, I see where you're going with this, but let's see where you go. I still have my doubts, right? But at least at the very start, when you present that as a research gap, what is the reader going to think? You're pitching a challenge to an established idea. I want to see whether you can prove it or not. It keeps the conversation, it keeps the reader going deeper and deeper into your work. Pick something that is slightly, I'm going to say have to be completely, entirely new and controversial, but challenge assumptions. Tell people that you think differently. Tell your supervisor and your co-marker that I'm going to think differently, and I'm willing to subject my ideas to the tests. That is you, your intellectual bravery, your intellectual courage showing through. We like that. I personally like that. And any supervisor or co-marker who doesn't is probably very insecure. Okay, consider these as research questions. First one seems pretty okay. I think we know right now that self-esteem and self-compassion are not the same. One is better than the other. I like the second and the fourth though, because when we talk about mental health awareness, when we increase students' understanding of mental health related terms and languages, does it make them more likely to then self-diagnose themselves? And therefore, as a result, cause them to be more sensitive or fragile psychologically? Some of you might think, maybe. Some of you say, no, that's not possible. Are you willing to put that idea to the test? Do you want to put that idea to the test? I personally find there's a lot of interest in this. I would say that there's an increase in false positive rates of mental health illnesses amongst undergraduate students. And you know, the group of students who seems to be afflicted most of all, psychology students. Is learning about psychology making psychology students more fragile? They may have, with increased awareness, a wider use of terms, vocabulary for describing mental health afflictions, but does this also then lead them to self-diagnose themselves, leading to reduced resilience and increased fragility? If you don't know the answer to that, but you'll be interested in knowing more, maybe that's a topic you might want to look into. See how much more interesting, refreshing those ideas are? You will want that, because this is how science advances. When someone challenges a paradigm or an established program, you're asking an alternative interpretation. You're offering rather an alternative interpretation for what has been widely been accepted to be true or a fact already. Lots of examples of shared goal setting, for instance, someone's challenged goal setting, and the original developers of the goal setting theory, Locke and Latham, shot back and said, like, no, this is wrong, this is misrepresentation of our idea, right? If you're comfortable enough inviting that, and you can pull it off through the good use of rigorous research designs, you can reason your way through it, I invite you to do so. Okay. Jack, you had a question?
It's very good. But then, like, how do we ensure that the design of the study like aligns with this? And because people never explored before, right? So the design of the study have to come up, you know.
Yep. So that's the additional challenge. And Jack's question is, if the proposed idea is controversial, but no study is actually done or done a formal investigation of it, maybe scale it back a little bit, right? Because if it's entirely novel, entirely new, the methods, the measures certainly will not be available for you to actually engage in a formal study. You might have to scale it back. You might even have to switch it over to a purely qualitative study. If that's not your thing, if you don't want to do that, then yeah, I think definitely scale it back. That might be too novel, right? Not wrong with asking controversial questions, but its complete newness means that you have very little to fall back on. Correct, there's no scaffolding, correct. Okay. All clear? We're about halfway through the slides. How's everyone holding up? Okay. Any other questions at this moment? No? Okay. Hopefully this has been useful so far. Okay, here's one. I'm just going to go on a limb and just say that every time we see this research gap, it's always the same comment that I'll put out. And I don't mean this in any of, a sort of cynical way, right? But scientifically speaking, research-wise, right? Why is it important that we conduct this study using a Malaysian sample and focusing on the Malaysian context? Many times what happens is, right, and this is why I'm saying our population gap is not usually a strong research gap. A lot of the initial theorizing, literature review is on the issue itself. It's on the proposed links between the variables. There's a potential mediator here, maybe a boundary condition that forms a moderator in the model. And then in the research gap, the author proposes this study needs to be extended to also include a Malaysian sample. I said, oh, it's a little bit of a letdown. Why? Because there was nothing in the previous sections that talked about why cultural differences matter. If you say motivational differences matter between cultures because academic culture is different, in Malaysian culture is very different. Far East Asian academic cultures test anxiety is rife because heavy pressures, heavy emphasis on academic performance as a gateway to better jobs, better careers, social standing. And then you want to test that in your study, sampling Far East Asian, Malaysian sample versus a non-Malaysian Western sample, then you have a justifiable cause for proposing this as a research gap. The gap here is and relies on you saying the context matters, the culture matters. I want to examine the differences between these two cultures. What does happen most of the time, though, is that here's all the research that tells us that motivation in academic performance matters. It differs. It's related to academic self-efficacy. It differs across men and women, right? So it differs between intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, and then the population gap is about here's why we need to do the study in Malaysia. It does not add up. By its very term, if you are saying cross-cultural, you are making comparisons already. Most studies don't do this. They sample a purely Malaysian sample. You're not cross-culturally referencing or comparing that with any other culture. It is then not a cross-cultural study. Okay. So here are the conditions, if you will, if you wanted to propose a population gap. First, make sure, right, that when you are conducting a cross-cultural study, you are comparing between cultures. The literature review theoretical framework needs to reflect this. Secondly, you need to sample both. Yes, it is possible. Students have done so before. They have sampled a Malaysian sample, compare that with a non-Malaysian sample. Some interesting findings, possible. If you have connections, if you have a friend who can help you with data collection, maybe they're studying overseas somewhere in the UK, yes, can be done. Right? But if not, then that's another reason for why it is not a cross-cultural comparison. If you can make predictions for why it is different, education systems, cultures, or attitudes towards higher education are different in the UK, any Western country compared to Malaysia, then yes, that's another piece of the puzzle. You explain why it's important. Why? Because when Malaysians study here and then they move over to postgraduate studies in the UK, it might be of an academic culture shock to them. Aha, okay, I can see why. We want to compare in between these two groups. We have good theoretical reasons too, and there's a good practical implication for why we are comparing these two cultures. Then you have reason to say, this is a population gap. We need to compare context, sample, because the theory suggests that they are likely to be different. Make sense? Okay, right. Yes, let's see. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Addressing a gap, vision should be just focusing
Mm-hmm.
So the way I view this as a cross-cultural might be in a way that I say because the social media environment here is very diverse, and so I get the difference with this, but maybe I'm justify as yes.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Wong, for that question. So the question here being, look, is it wrong or is it inappropriate to say, I want to conduct a study on social media cultures, custom practice habits, maybe even, or behaviors here in and amongst Malaysians because no study has been done in Malaysia, firstly. Secondly, the social media environment you were saying is different over in the West or a different context. Question I would then ask you to consider is, are your methods, are your measures comparable? And is the data collection conducted at a time point that is also comparable to make for some kind of meaningful comparison between that previous study and your current study? So when you sample one but not the other, but you wish to make a comparison between your current sample with that of a previous study in a different context, yes, this is where your argument for cross-cultural come from. Is the comparison fair enough to say that the procedures, the methods, the measures, the timing of the data collection was collected roughly around the same time for me to make this comparison? Many times it's too big a gap. You could say that the last time this study was conducted was 4 or 5 years ago. What happened 4 or 5 years ago? COVID, lockdown, restrictions. I'm now conducting a follow-up study on social media habits in and amongst patients to compare that against that sample in the UK. Hard to draw the comparison. Time has probably shifted or changed quite a number of things in between those two time points of data collection. So you might hold constant that the main difference is the social media, the virtual environment. But there's just one thing, right, folks? If you're listening in, if you're hearing in, tuning into this, right? This is why we like longitudinal studies. Time is not something that we can control in cross-sectional studies. The one key influence that we often don't account for, and we cannot account for in cross-sectional studies, is time. And we know time changes a lot of things, right? So maybe draw some reasonable conclusions. You could, right? Just say in the discussion that this aligns with or it extends on previous research, but of course admit that a more direct comparison in which at the same point in time, samples from two different contexts and cultures are collected, measures are the same, align for a more direct comparison, then that's a better claim to say that this is a cross-cultural study. Okay, all right, cool. We will move on to just a few more slides, really, right? We are already at the midpoint, and I want to spend a little bit more time on the discussion section. I know we are getting on with time. It's maybe just an hour already, so maximum not half an hour, and then we'll have some Q&A. Okay, here's another point on getting to the point. Avoid what we call weasel words. Words which are in and of themselves doesn't mean anything. It's at best a very vague reference to something or a time point. Depending on when I read the thesis, nowadays could be any time from now to 15 years ago. Depending on who you consider to be experts, the term experts highlight that. This is kind of like the 8 out of 10 dentists prefer Oral-B, and then the dentist will come out and say that we have never been asked for our preferences of like toothbrushes or toothpastes. Right? Most people believe that one is a little bit less common. But nowadays, if you're speaking to current trends, use precise dates. Over the past 15 years, bracket 2015 to 2025, right? So that's your reference time point. Now, this is in itself, right, by itself, very vague. Second point, so first point on weasel words, less is more. You do not have to hit the word count. Circle this, highlight this. Many students have approached their thesis thinking the more I write, the more complicated, the more technical sounding my thesis is, the higher mark I will get. Not with me, it doesn't, right? I've said this before, I'll say it again. Don't count your words, make your words count. If you need to stretch it out to 8,000 words for your quantitative study, right? By all means, go ahead and use that. You have that, right? But make sure that each word, each sentence, and as a result, each paragraph conveys something useful, additional information. Of course, if you have a more complex model, a mediated moderation, moderated mediation, then yeah, sure, I can understand why you would stretch it out, right? Especially if you have interesting findings. As a partial mediation, but the partial mediation is eliminated when the moderation is in place. Oh, that is interesting. Technical, complex, of course, requires more words, understand. But if you're running a fairly straightforward analysis, comparison of means, you could supplement that with diagrams and graphics, but the reporting of the results does not need to be too wordy. Let the graphics speak for your results. Briefly mention that as described or as depicted in figure 1, the mean scores of the coffee drinking group scored higher on attention span, ability to regulate their emotions compared to the non-coffee drinking group. And then you just toss in the stats there, right? But again, the graphic speaks to the findings. The visuals really leave an impact and make the findings easier to understand and comprehend. Your thesis is not a mystery novel. Sometimes you get a thesis that's written to a point where is this going? This sounds interesting. So you're stringing the reader along, but you're not building a case by case. You're dropping a few crumbs here. Say, oh, this is also important, right? But you know, this other study also tells us that social media and loneliness are not related. And then eventually, for some reason or other, the research question is about attachment styles. So how did we get from loneliness and social media use to attachment styles is not clear. I know you enjoy some suspense. Again, maybe it's Halloween, I don't know, right? But don't leave your readers guessing is what I'm saying. Next 2 points. You ever read articles that sound really impressive? You think that you're going to walk away feeling enlightened. Maybe it's one of those post-modernist books or articles. As we live in a post-truth era. Words are used to dominate, to control power, to allocate or redistribute who has the say and who doesn't. I'm not a big fan of postmodernism, right? Simply because they have been called out for something called obscurantism. Really just a fancy term for saying that if your writing is complicated, it sounds profound, you're using a whole bunch of really impressive sounding words. Most of the time they use phenomenological, quantum, those kinds of words, consciousness. If it does not make sense, but it sounds profound, it is most likely bullshit. I've been told, and this is something that my supervisor told me when I was doing my dissertation, convoluted writing sometimes is a mask for a lack of understanding. In academics, in scientific research, deliberately trying to conceal the evidence, deliberately trying to wriggle your way out of an uncomfortable finding or an uncertainty about an idea, that is not only a lack of clarity, that is seen as dishonesty. It's not dishonesty that lands you in trouble with DIC. So you're not going to get into the DIC for convoluted writing, but you won't get very high marks either, because if your writing is only understood by you and you alone, it's generally not good writing. Good authors will recognize that, look, if I don't make my points clear enough to you, that is on me. That is not on you to force your way towards understanding what I have. If I've not written it in a way that it's clear enough for you to take away the key findings, it's not enough for you to walk away saying that, I felt smarter from reading that. Then the onus, the problem, the issue is in the writer, the authors themselves, not the reader. Right. Final point, a model is worth 1,000 words. For those of you who are proposing slightly complex models, I would think, again, mediators, moderators are in the picture. Well, present that as a picture. If you can present that tested model in a diagram, I like diagrams. I like models. Okay? Only a handful of you actually presented a graphical representation of your model for your 202 concept papers. Okay? If you did, good for you. You're generally one of those that got a pretty high mark, right? Not just because of the model, but because that model depicted, here's clarity of thinking. Here is an argument that I'm proposing, and I can represent it in a graphical form. For mediating models, suggestion, present the model first. Once you have the results, present the model again, but with the statistical output, the beta values, the significance values. It allows the reader. We have short attention spans, folks, co-markers, assessors alike. They might have read it and say, I think it's a mediation model, right? But once you present it twice again, you're reminded and say, here's the model, here's the model. Short-lived, forgetful old professor, right? This is what the model says, right? Do it. Tell them. Make it easy for them. If you make the information accessible, readable to the co-marker, your supervisor, right? They're going to like your work better. It's an impression management thing when it comes to writing a thesis. Wong Fei is left already. This was the section actually he might find most relevant, right? But okay, when it comes to writing your methods and your procedures, here are some general takeaways. If you can write it in a way that is clear enough to allow someone to replicate it, do so. Your procedures is essentially a step-by-step guide of how to repeat my study. Think about it that way. If we take apart, right, all the other portions of your literature, if I know nothing about your theory, your theoretical framework, but I say, I want to help you replicate this study. Tell me what I need to do. If I read your methods and your procedures section in particular, and I know what steps to follow, then yes, that is a good methods/procedures section. Couple of things for the individual components. We're going to go through them fairly briefly. Design, just write brief. Non-experimental correlational study employing an online survey. That's it. It can be as short as 1 or 2 sentences. The survey was hosted on Google Forms. That's it. When you read your academic articles, right, do they go on and describe at length the method, the measures, the variables? No, they don't. They get to the point. The methods, next, this is going to stop, right? The measures and the skills that you're using are in the drum roll measure section, scale section. That's when you go into detail, right? On the scale reliabilities. Also toss in a sample item because the reader may not know that measure. They say, okay, this is a measure of what is this eudaimonia? What in the world is that? One item might be, I'm living my life to its fullest. My life is perceived as meaningful. Okay, so that stuff, right? They may not have words for it, but at least they know one, two, the items and get a rough sense of what the measure is about. For your sample, report the initial and the final sample. Justify using your G-power analysis. Procedures I've already mentioned. Report the steps clearly so that anyone reading it, even without an understanding of the theory, can replicate the study results. Here's one important thing. Sometimes the details are lost in the midst of all the Greek symbols that your statistical labels require you to. Help the reader understand which hypotheses are supported and which are not. Make it clear. The results provide support for hypothesis 1. The non-significant mediating effect here indicates that no support was found for hypothesis 2. Map the results to the hypothesis. And then wrap it up again towards the end by presenting the model by saying, here's the model, here's the diagram, here's where the p-value is greater than 0.05, here's what the beta value is, and so forth. If you're doing comparison of groups, right, a bar chart might be helpful. A bar chart with some error bars and an arrow that shows the difference, whether the difference between the taller bar and the shorter bar is significantly different, statistically significant between each of them. Anyone who's presenting, and I'm not a big fan of this, I struggle sometimes to actually comprehend what's going on here, even with peer reviews. Interaction plots, right? For interactions to happen, the lines need to cross, correct? Here's tips for some of you who are doing your 202 methods paper later on. The lines cannot be parallel with one another. They need to cross. Okay, so as a projected set of results, make sure that your interaction plot does have that, well, interaction in form of the lines running over one another. Questions? We are at the final bit of our workshop. It's good that you've been holding most of your attention here. There's quite a fair bit, isn't it? I wish I kind of known all this. And for those of you who are in the midst of your thesis already, please don't let anything that I've said here today say that, oh my God, I have messed up my thesis. I wish I knew all this, right? So come and have a chat with me, right? I'm going to be sharing this with the 202 cohort, right? Especially for students from 202 who are not in the session today, but the slides have already been made available to you. Please come and have a chat with me if there's something that you're really worried about from what I've said from the session, and then we'll find some way to pitch and present it in such a way. It's not a lost cause. Please don't think of your study, whichever stage it's in, as a quote unquote lost cause. If I can share with you, if it's any reassurance, there have been some papers, right, that I've submitted, got rejected from journals, right, and said, okay, maybe there's a different way to spin this. That's still going to be something that you can salvage and maybe even present in a convincing way, knowing all of this for your thesis. I've done so for my articles. Some articles have had a longer history of rejection before it eventually got acceptance, right? So yeah, it's not as if you submit everything, you get acceptance. No, the default for most researchers is rejection, right? Let's tidy up with the next couple of, and this is the concluding bit of our workshop here today, right? As we move on to the discussion, I have shared with you earlier on that the discussion is, it's a difficult section to write for many good reasons. Firstly, you actually be quite tired already by the time you get to the discussion. The results are out. You say, I know what this means. Do I really need to write it all out again? You lose your energy. You lose the steam. You lose the kind of motivation to get the discussion written clearly well enough. Here are a couple of things to avoid, though. Firstly, don't think of your discussion as a checklist against past findings. I'm not sure what's been said to you in your research methods classes, right? But the format of published studies is not, the results of my study indicate such and such. This is consistent with one other study. This is also consistent with this other study. It is inconsistent with this other study. That is not how a discussion section is written. What we would want to read most of, what journal reviewers want, what I certainly want to read more of is, what is the broad theme from your findings? Once you summarize the results, I'm going to be thinking to myself, what does this all mean for this conversation, this research area, this topic of scientific investigation. That is what a good discussion section. This is another opportunity for you to show how smart you are. It's another opportunity for you to say that I ran the study, here are the results. I found support for some, but support for not all the other hypotheses. This all means something in relation to the topic that I am investigating. That one particular need in self-determination theory, even though I measure all three basic needs, this is most important for motivating academic performance. Not all motivations are created equally. The results of my study suggest that when we take a broad brush approach to say that motivation is all that matters, as long as the student is intrinsically motivated, that's not good enough. Intrinsically motivated students are primarily driven by one or two needs, more so than the other. That's a nuance, that is a wrinkle, that is a specific finding that would not have been apparent if you did not run your study. Highlight that. This is how you sound smart in your writing. But it does not mean that you are faking that smart. You are just saying that I've observed something that other researchers have not been able to. And I have data to prove it. Here's why it's important. That is so much more impressive than saying, here's what my study found. I've cross-checked it against past studies. It's similar to this. It's not similar to that. It's similar to this, and it's also different from that. Okay. First thing that you also want to address, right? I put it here. Yeah. So not a consistent versus inconsistent. Okay. That second point there is also important. If you did not find support for your hypothesis, you need to explain why. Many a times, what students do is to say, well, because the theory was maybe not a good match, to which I respond by saying that, then why didn't you use a better theory, right? Well, it was because this other study found differently, right? So why didn't you respond to that and review that initially in your literature review? So first thing, and I like seeing this, is when you say that there's something in the way in which I conducted the study that might have led to the results. Be honest. When you're forthcoming and saying that, oh, wow, you know what? If I had run the study maybe using a different measure or have collected the data at a different time, or if I sampled more broadly, then maybe we will have found support. Acknowledge that. I personally like that because you then turn that assessment of your results inward to saying that it could have been me. It could have been something that I did or did not do in my methods that has led to the results. If you jump over and say that because previous studies did not do this, right, it's kind of like finger pointing at other people to say that their results should be consistent with yours, and it's because they, for whatever reason, whatever thing they did, has led to you not getting the results that you had hoped for. Start with yourself first. Even if it is a flaw in some extent, you are at least honest about that. And the co-marker and assessor is going to think, well, okay, it's reasonable. Might have done a little bit better with like pre-planning, right? But you don't want to be in a situation where you are called out for the error in your procedure or in your measures. Call it out yourself first. That's going to also open up an opportunity for you to write what? Here's what I would do differently. You know what that section is called? You already know it. Suggestions for future research. It all adds up in that way. Admit it yourself first, and then say that here's what I would do differently. Here's a suggestion, right, to extend and to improve on the study that I've just concluded. Got that? Okay. This is a famous one. This is a popular one. You might want to recite this as a mantra. Your discussion is not an extended literature review. Many a times, even articles get sent my way for review, for peer review, right? I say like, this is the same thing as I've read in the literature review. Why was it not covered there earlier on? It should not be titled, right? I think this is quite a creative title if I say so myself. Literature review part 2, all the things I wish I read and better understood earlier. It should not be that. Do not invoke theories to explain findings that were unexpected or that you did not hypothesize. If it sounds like hindsight bias, if it sounds like, hey, when I'm reading this discussion, it sounds like you could have thought about this earlier on, isn't it? If you ask my former students or my current students why I fuss so much about theoretical framework, is to help them avoid this situation. Avoid a situation in which they're done with the results and they get to the discussion and they say, oh, I should have thought about this earlier on. I should have considered this a little bit earlier on. I should have reviewed this theory because this seems a lot more relevant than what theory I used to frame my study earlier on. Getting that first part right is crucial. If you have that set convincingly in stone, the rest of the work usually, typically follows to just fine. Don't wait until the discussion before you realize that you could have opted for a more appropriate theory. That's not what the discussion is for. Okay? All right, so it's an extended literature review. First point there is to say that don't extrapolate between the data. So extrapolate is just a fancy term for saying that here's what the data tells us. You've just told a story that the numbers don't. Here's one example. A very, very long time ago, I had a master's student did a study of gender differences in, of all things, right? Can you believe this? Of all things, kiasuism. Are men or women more kiasu than? Okay, kiasuism is a term, right? Which literally translates in Hokkien as afraid to lose, but it's not afraid of losing usually something material, something psychological, like losing face, like losing status, or coming across as committing an act that invites shame, right? You didn't do well, for instance, right? So you're hyperactive and you are motivated to actually prevent that loss of face or status, right? So that's a very crude definition. So the student did and you think it's actually a straightforward enough design. Gender comparisons in rates and tendency of kiasuism. Collect responses on a kiasuism scale. There is a kiasuism scale, by the way, right? Collect the scores, divide them between men and women, compare t-tests, any differences? No, no differences. The discussion was, I think, 20 pages long for a non-significant difference. You know what it spilled over to? Gender role differences, division of labor, and then there was like pride differences between men and women. I said, none of this is directly relevant. You did not find any comparison differences between men and women on this scale. That is all you found. Keep it within 2 pages maximum. Your discussion, right? Its length is going to vary depending on, of course, the complexity of your model. But this is a more extreme example to say that non-significant finding between 2 groups, men and women, on one scale does not require 20 pages of discussion. Keep it commensurate, keep it matched to what you found, what you did not find, what you had hoped to find, right? Final slide before we close and invite more questions. Good time as well, because 2 o'clock, I have another thing to go to. Implications. We still get submissions that don't quite understand what implications are. Sometimes it reads like an extension of the discussion. If you want to simplify it, right, just answer these 2 questions. So what, now what? Implications, suggestions for future research, captured into that 4-letter question. So what, now what? The so what, you would already know, is divided into theory and practice. So what for theory, so what for advances in research. So what for practice, practical implications, so what for the real world. If someone were to make use of the data, the knowledge, the findings, right? What could they make use of my findings for? That's your practical implication. One thing I would say for either implication is to go beyond these 2 words, add understanding. Of course, everything adds understanding. So if you have a finding, whether it's significant or otherwise, hypothesis supported or otherwise, it does add understanding, but that in itself is quite vague. Does it extend, challenge, invite a possible refinement of ideas? Those are more nuanced. Those are more specific. Does it allow policymakers? Does it shape the design of interventions? Those are more specific and nuanced practical implications. Okay, right. So as a final point, right, when you are asked to suggest directions for future research, yes, you can go back to the limitations. You would say, now what? How do we move from this study? It could be a design advance to say that the results are correlational, but it would be great to test this in a lab setting, ethics permitting, of course. Or if you think that the effects are, say you're doing some kind of developmental research, the results will be interesting to explore, or the study would be extended by exploring developments across the lifespan, of which a longitudinal study would be possible. Hey, you don't have to do it, so go nuts. What's the ambitious way of expanding upon this research? I did a study on attachment styles. I did a study on the so-called quarter midlife crisis, but only collected data at one particular time point. Developmental studies really lend themselves well to longitudinal designs. You already know that. Suggest it. You don't have to do it. But when you suggest that, you are telling the reader you are familiar with more advanced methods, even if you were not taught to use them. Right? You're conveying your familiarity with the research literature and the methods that informs these studies. Acknowledge the limitations. You will often get asked this question during your Viva as well. What would you do if you could do the study again? What would you improve on? Those are just your oral versions, right? The spoken versions of the questions that you would answer your co-assessor or your supervisor. Write them down. So at least you know what to respond, how to respond if you're asked this exact same question. All right, I think we are done. That is actually the final slide. So thank you for your attention. I hope you found that session useful. Hopefully it did not provoke additional anxiety or, oh my gosh, I think it did, but please have a chat with me if that is you. No judgments, of course. Grab a hold of the QR code and give your Psi Chi team a round of applause first for organizing this session. Thank you, Psi Chi team. And to also offer them some feedback on how this session, myself, right, can be improved for future similar workshops. So thank you very much. We still have a bit of time. I need to dash off for a HGA class at 1:50. So maybe around 20 minutes or so, I'll be here if you have Q&A. But otherwise, thank you so much for your attention. I hope you found this useful.